So now let's go ahead and talk about one of the basic building blocks of the Keynesian model, and that's the idea of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is the demand for real GDP. So it's the demand for all final goods and services. And you should remember that we have this formula for calculating GDP, and that's that GDP, Y, equals consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And we often write this parenthetical term here as NX for net exports. And the basic idea here is we're going to draw on the same kind of thinking that we have for normal microeconomics, except now, instead of the quantity of milk, it's the quantity of real GDP, Y, that we're talking about. And instead of the price of some particular product, we have the general price index, something like the CPI or the GDP deflator. And we have an aggregate demand curve. And so far, so good. What we're saying here is when prices are high, people don't want to buy that many final goods and services. And when prices go down, then people want to buy more final goods and services. So we're saying there's a negative relationship between these two. And again, we saw this kind of thing in microeconomics. So this should look fairly familiar to you. It's actually not obvious and not without controversy that the aggregate demand curve, AD, slopes down. Because you can imagine the following sort of argument. Yes, an increase in prices makes Alice want to buy less. That's certainly how it works in a microeconomic context, because essentially Alice can't afford as much, right? But it's also true that an increase in prices leads to higher income for seller Bob. So you can imagine an argument that says, well, maybe the aggregate demand curve just goes straight up and down, because, you know, if the increase in prices essentially just redistributes income from Alice to Bob, then maybe it doesn't impact the total amount that people want to buy. Or maybe even if somehow Bob spends more of his income than Alice does, then maybe as we redistribute income from Alice to Bob, maybe actually we see the amount of real GDP that people want to buy goes up. So, two lessons from this. First lesson is things that make sense at the micro level, at the level of an individual or a particular market, don't always make sense at the macro level. And sometimes we need to dig a little deeper and have a little bit more investigation before we can know that. So the analogy here that often gets brought up by economists is the idea of what happens if you go to, say, a sporting event. So you go to a baseball game, and it's true that if you stand up, you'll be able to get a better view. But if everyone stands up, then everyone's view is pretty much the same as they had before, because, you know, yes, you're now higher up off the ground, but so is the person in front of you, and on net, nobody's that much better off. But, all that said, there are reasons why we think the aggregate demand curve does, in fact, slope up. And these are going to be three main reasons. One is what's sometimes called the real balances or real wealth effects. And the idea here is that some wealth is held in nominal forms. So your currency in particular is specified to have a particular nominal value. That $20 bill has a particular value. And so if you have, $200 and the price of a super fancy burger is $8, then you can afford to buy 40 burgers. If there's a higher price, is that right? 50, excuse me. No. 25. That's better. Okay. 25 burgers. If prices go up to $10, you can only afford to buy 20 burgers. So, essentially, the rise in the price level lowers your level of real wealth. This is in contrast to, say, for instance, what went on with incomes, where there's a redistribution of incomes. In this case, even Bob, even if he has higher income because the prices went up, he now has lower real wealth because his existing stock of assets in his bank account is now worth less. The second thing that tends to happen out there is the effect of prices on interest rates. So, before we talked about how interest rates influence money demand. And that's one way of thinking about it, that if we have high interest rates, then people demand less liquid money because they'd rather put their money in a savings account where it can earn interest. It's also true, though, that if people face a higher price level, then they demand more money because they need more liquid money to get through all of their transactions. When they demand more liquid money, that means they want to pull money out of their savings and into their checking accounts. So out of illiquid assets, like certificates of deposits, and into checking accounts. As they do that, they're reducing the supply of assets into this liquid market, and when they reduce the supply there, that's going to prove to have or lead to higher interest rates. So banks, as people start to pull their money out of their certificates of deposits or their savings accounts, banks might raise interest rates to try and get them to keep their money in those savings accounts or certificates of deposits. So that's another potential one. What we're going to see here finally is that there's going to be an effect on net exports. So while it's true that an increase in the domestic price level potentially redistributes both the expense and the income at the same time, when there's an increase in the price level in the U.S., then U.S. goods are more expensive overseas. And there's no corresponding rise in overseas incomes, as there was in the domestic case. So in the domestic case, Bob had higher income, and that canceled out the fact that Alice might buy less. Here, if U.S. goods are more expensive, it isn't somehow that U.S. goods being more expensive causes suppliers in Mexico to have more money suddenly. So there's no corresponding rise in overseas incomes, and so there's a net fall in the demand for U.S. exports. So those are our main three reasons why a higher price level does in fact higher prices mean less real GDP demanded. Another way of looking at all this, and this allows us to kind of merge the Keynesian school and the neoclassical school, is if we think about our quantity equation of money, MV equals PY, the money supply times the velocity of money equals the price level times real GDP. So money supply, velocity, price level, something like the GDP deflator. And this is real GDP. We can go ahead and solve this guy around here. And we can go ahead and say that real GDP, we're going to divide both sides by P, real GDP equals MV over P. And if we were to graph that, it would look something like this. So one way of thinking about the aggregate demand curve is that it is a reflection of the quantity theory of money equation. So that's another way of looking at it. Life would be boring if the aggregate demand curve just sat there. So what's going to cause shifts of the aggregate demand curve? Basically, anything that changes something on this right-hand side so anything that changes C, I, G, or net exports, except a change in the general price level P. Because that change in the general price level P is exactly what causes a movement along this curve. So a movement along the curve is due to a change in the general price level P. Anything else is going to cause a shift to a whole new curve. So if consumers suddenly just get more optimistic and they want to spend more, then consumption spending goes up. And so consumption spending goes up, and that also increases real GDP, and we know left is less and right is more, so we shift out to aggregate demand curve number 2. So again, the number of things that could go out there and change any of these variables is huge. It could be that, well, there's a booming demand for, U.S. trained fracking engineers and their equipment, and that generates export earnings for U.S. companies. Or it could be that we have a government shutdown, and therefore government spending goes down, or who knows what else. There's just a huge number of things that could shift those different spending patterns for real GDP.